Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we delve into a word that we've been using for some time, as we've been exploring the UFO, now called UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena. So what we're going to explore today is anomalous. What does anomalous mean? And to enable us to comprehend the importance of the anomalous, I want to begin today by referring to the great work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, who was one of the great scientists, really, of the 20th century, both in terms of the history of science and the political and social implications of science. He was a professor at four of the great elite universities in the United States, starting out at Harvard, then to UC Berkeley, and then to Princeton, and then finishing up at MIT before his death in 1972. It was while he was at Berkeley in 1962 that he published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that work became an instant classic and is one of the most widely read books in the social sciences to the present day. It was Thomas Kuhn that popularized the notion of paradigms. He was not the one who coined the term paradigm, but he framed the scientific inquiry in terms of paradigms. And that was the revolution in his thought and at the basis of his revolutionary analysis of scientific revolutions. Up to that time, people thought, well, there's science, and science is about objective data, and you create a hypothesis, you do tests, you collect information, and then you draw it together and create a theory, and everything's based on objective data. You know, the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. Thomas Kuhn says, no, that's not how science works. That's not how science develops. Science is an amalgamation of objective data and subjective context. So the culture, the religious beliefs, the norms of one's time influences what we consider to be objective. And that's why he said science progresses not linearly, but I would say, borrowing from evolutionary theory, catastrophically. And Kuhn differentiated scientific paradigms into three stages. The first, he says, is pre-science, when you're basically seeing data out there, but you don't really have a way to interpret it because there's not enough data to even come up with a hypothesis, much less a theory. Remember the Gaia hypothesis by James Lovelock. At first, it was a hypothesis. He gathered data and then put forward the hypothesis that the Earth is a living superorganism. And that superorganism is intentional, communicative. And at first, he was reviled by other scientists who said that can't possibly be correct. But the more data was gathered by scientists around the world, the more confirmation the Gaia hypothesis received, and now it has developed into the Gaia theory. That's how science works, that it starts with pre-science, gathering data. And then, says Kuhn, after a certain amount of data is accumulated and a certain theoretical framework is established to explain all the data that you know, it evolves into what he calls normal science. And normal science is like 20th century physics. It's what is considered to be true. And anything that doesn't quite fit into the paradigm is considered a mistake. But those mistakes, says Kuhn, are really anomalies. And it is the accumulation of anomalies, unidentified anomalous phenomena, that challenge the existing paradigm until the old paradigm has so many anomalies that it reaches what Kuhn calls a crisis. And then comes the third stage, revolutionary science. That's what's happening in physics, in cosmology, in virtually every area of human knowledge. The anomalies are just proliferating like AI. And all of a sudden, the old paradigm gets exploded. And that the revolutions are now happening so fast, we can't even keep up with them. And we have been undergoing that same process with the UFOs. Think about it for a moment. I would say that from 1947, say from Roswell, to maybe about the year 2000, we were in the realm of pre-science with regard to UFOs, UAP. The government denied they even existed. Researchers like Richard Dolan and others were ferreting away, trying to put together information in a kind of a haphazard way because there was so much classification and secrecy, etc. But over the decades, enough information about the UFOs began to accumulate that it caused, there was so many anomalies, there was so many UAPs around, that the system went into crisis. Thousands of people were seeing UFOs, fighter pilots, people on the aircraft carrier Nimitz, ordinary people, presidents like Carter and Reagan. People were seeing so many anomalies that the existing paradigm that UFOs aren't true collapsed. And that's where we are now. We're at the beginning of that third revolutionary science phase as a new paradigm begins to emerge that is revolutionary in nature because it is blown apart the old paradigm. But the new paradigm hasn't even come into place yet. And that's what's so exciting about what we're doing on Humanity Rising and with all the partners, like the partnership between New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University to create an extraterrestrial studies program. It's the first program in history. Our training program. What are the facts? Never been done before. ET awareness and communication. as part of this new revolutionary science is an extraordinary moment in world history, in the history of science, and for all of us personally, to be alive at this time when the great revolution is now opening up before us, and we're realizing that we are not alone. So what paradigm, what interactivity between the data about UFOs, UAP, and our cultural, I would say, metaphysical context for understanding the data is going to create the new paradigm. And that's one reason why I'm in Washington, is because we want, working with many, many partners, to create the paradigm around UFOs, UAP, that is open-hearted, that is democratic, that is transparent, that seeks the ET technology for the human good, that supports interaction with extraterrestrial intelligences in a open-minded way. That's the emerging paradigm that we want to bring into the world. So Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions is very important to understanding where we are in our moment. We've moved from pre-science to normal science to now revolutionary science. And a whole new possibility for human understanding is emerging. So it's within that context, I want to introduce a good friend and colleague, Jeff Dunne, who spent a lot of time looking at this phenomenon that are anomalous. He took his Ph.D. in nuclear physics at Purdue. He then went to Johns Hopkins in their physics department in 2003. He's also the chairman of the International Consciousness Research Lab, the successor to the Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research, which is a partner with Ubiquity and New Paradigm Institute in our ET studies program and our School of Science and Consciousness. He's been on Humanity Rising before. And so, Jeff, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. And Jeff is going to give us a presentation on what he thinks the anomalous phenomenon is all about. And then I'll circle back and we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. But Jeff, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. You've done a wonderful job. So I should just say, are there any questions?
That's just to tee you up, man.
Yeah. So it's an interesting topic, I think, for everybody. The question of what is sort of the nature of the anomalous. I can tell you for myself personally, it was particularly interesting having grown up in a laboratory called the Engineering Anomalies Laboratory. It was as common a word as any that anybody uses. Every day you talk about, well, the anomalies, and it just was the thing, or pardon me, it was just a thing, and it wasn't until a few years ago where I stopped and I had to for whatever reason, step back, and I said, do I really understand what is the nature of an anomaly, right? And what it has to offer. Jim talked about it, and I'm going to repeat a little bit about what Jim said because it is a nice sort of graceful segue into some of the observations that I want to make. But the reason that I thought that this was a topic worth sharing or with on Humanity Rising was really because the value of anomalies, I think, is vastly underrated. And if I could summarize this, so if you fall asleep 30 seconds from now, you'll get the point of the talk. And that is that anomalies really are an incredible gift to us. They are the things that help highlight areas where our model of reality, right, doesn't quite do it. That's what anomalies are really telling us, is where we don't understand, or the things that are different. And there's some interesting sort of next steps in that conclusion, and I'll talk about those later. For example, some of the kinds of things that we talk about in terms of anomalies, and especially synchronicities, have a lot more to offer in terms not only of understanding what the world is, what our universe, what reality is, and how it works, but in fact for ourselves. What is, for example, what is it that maybe we're really heading towards? If you've heard me talk in the past, one of my favorite topics is syntropy, the idea that we are not only driven forward by the causes of what is in our past, but also sort of future purpose towards which we are aiming. And synchronicities as a type of anomaly can be hints to help us sort of hone in on that. So it's worth starting this by just talking for briefly about what is an anomaly, what do people consider to be anomalous? And of course, there's a wide variety of ways of interpreting that term, right? To some people, that is just constrained to things like, well, whenever I go by a traffic light in this particular frame of mind, I can't help but notice that lights blow out more often. Met a lot of people who are like that. Some who it's actually a life challenge for them. They bust mechanical and electrical equipment all the time, to the point that it really gets in the way of sort of living the way that most people do. Right. For other people, the anomalous might be things that seem to be meaningful coincidences, right? Having, for example, this sense that something's going to happen and then it happens. And similar to that, and sort of connected to it, it's sort of a gray line that's between them, receiving information that is not received in the traditional way, right? We think of ourselves as having five senses. So if we're going to learn something, it's because we see it or hear it or smell it or touch it or taste it. And that's a topic completely into itself, as to whether those really are the only five senses, or those five senses really are our only senses. But also anomalous things such as having an effect on the world around you in ways that shouldn't, by traditional interpretation, be possible. The psychokinetic effects, for example, that tremendous numbers of studies at this point demonstrating the reality of this, and yet for most people they're still considered to be anomalous, right? And the truth is, when you think about what makes something anomalous, as I mentioned, it certainly, and in fact Jim mentioned as well, right? It's a question of, does it fit into the established model of reality, right? And that model of reality, another way of saying that is, do we consider this thing that has happened to be reasonable? Is it a rational kind of thing? Can we understand it? But I think for most people, it goes a little bit further. And that is that it's not only whether or not it's something that fits into the model of reality, but whether or not we're prepared or comfortable discussing it. And that plays a role in what we sort of mentally categorize as anomalous. Um, right. And I would hope, as sort of an additional call to action out of this presentation, that what we continue to do is open the dialogue so that we can talk about these kinds of events, experiences, in a way that demystifies them in some sense, or if not demystifies them, at least puts them into the discourse so that we can understand them and understand how many other people are having them. I get quite a few calls or emails usually these days, on a weekly basis, from people saying, I had this thing that happened to me, but I don't know who else to tell. But you run this International Consciousness Research Laboratories. You may have heard something like this. And after a while, you realize just how uncomfortable people are sharing it, because they've been told you shouldn't talk about this sort of thing. And that can be anywhere from things that are really just not even on the edge of anomalous, things like the death experience, which is far from anomalous, all the way through to having a vision, or to having some kind of communication that comes from somewhere else, which most people generally say this is an anomalous kind of event. Right? And I would say that our goal in a lot of this is to make them acceptable acceptable topics for conversation. Right? What's interesting is another way of looking at this is the question of commonality. Is it anomalous just because it doesn't happen very often? It's a rare event, but also in my experience, growing experience, and not specifically from ICRL, but in general, right? Having those conversations, I have discovered that most people have experiences that would fall into that category. Some of them are, sort of remarkable. I feel, I had this experience where I affected something through my intention. It made a change in the world. Some of them are simply, I had this insight into something. I don't know why I had that insight, but why is that? Why should we feel that that's unreasonable? Shouldn't we all have experiences of intuition? We, at least most people that I know, I would probably gauge 90% of them, have had experiences where they say, I had the sense that somebody was looking at me, and I turned around and somebody was there looking at me. I felt it, right? It's incredibly common. And yet there is no physics explanation for that. We don't put pressure out in terms of any kind of physical phenomena from our eyes or anything like that. And yet it's a real thing. And it's sufficiently real that many organizations incorporate that into the way that they do their business and so forth, especially if you're doing things with personal interactions. Right? Some things are anomalous, of course, and we completely dismiss it as being in any way mysterious at all. For example, take some random act of kindness, which hopefully will become more and more non-anomalous, right? We'll be doing that as much as we possibly can. But if you think about that random act of kindness and what the implications of that are, right? It is an anomaly. It doesn't happen very often. When it happens, we're usually surprised by it. And yet that we do just, oh, well, that's just one of those things, right? But is it, right? Do we really understand? Is it just one of those things that we can forget and go about our day? Particularly if you think about the nature of synchronicities and what is meaningful in a person's life, that random act of kindness perhaps shifts your mood, changes the way that you interpret the things that happen for the rest of your day, which then has this butterfly effect potentially through the rest of your life. Could be an extremely profound, beyond sort of normality experience, but we tend to ignore it. Learning to pay attention to these things obviously has a lot of power that it can give us as individuals. So an interesting psychological sidebar to all of this that I'm not going to get into, but maybe this is a topic for the after chat or something, right? But it begs the question that how did we become a society that accepts and even promotes really the discounting of personal experiences? Where if somebody says, I had this interesting thing that happened, no, that was just your imagination. How many people as children are told that the things that they experienced, they shouldn't be paying attention to? That wasn't a legitimate experience. How did we get to that point? It's interesting. So does something being unexpected make an anomaly? Yes. Yeah, I would say technically it does. But it's an interesting way that we handle this, right? Some of them we say are interesting or not, as I just described, right? And the way that we usually do that is by coming up with the answer to, can we come up with a rational explanation for this, right? And if we do, is it reasonable then to discount what happened because it has a rational explanation? But I would argue that this is not a particularly good argument for this, right? We can continue to, or the argument basically goes, why would we add some new aspect, some new piece of a model of reality when we can explain what happened with the old ones? Well, at some point, the old explanations may not feel particularly satisfying, right? For example, if I discover that by focusing my attention on a random event generator, I seem to change the statistics, come out with that, and somebody says, well, that could happen just as a random fluke. Okay, but if you do it 100 times or 1,000 times or 10,000 times and it continues to happen, at some point the explanation of it's a random fluke kind of falls flat, doesn't it? There is perhaps a better explanation for this that can be added into the model of reality that doesn't require us to sort of go into the fantastical, particularly when it comes to discounting the experiences. I would argue, based on that this idea of an anomaly is something that sort of, and in fact, this is, I copied it down, so I usually don't do this, but I went to the great internet and I said, define anomaly. And the definition was something that deviates from what is standard, normal, or expected. And I thought that was not bad. But I would offer a slightly different definition. I would say that something is anomalous when it represents evidence refuting the standardly accepted model of reality. Technically speaking, I'm not really saying anything different. The difference is in the flavor of the definition, the implications, right? The idea that an anomaly, an experience, an anomalous experience is evidence that should motivate us to question the model of reality, as opposed to a thing that happened that probably should be dismissed as a result of that, right? We should, and if we can get into a mindset that is to start looking at these things that happen and saying, that's really interesting. Let me understand that better. Let me talk to people about this and see if other people have had that experience, right? We're in a much better position than starting off with this assumption that what we experienced must have been a hallucination and therefore it must be completely wrong. And the fact is that it's very sensible to do that. To question these things. That's the basis of the scientific method. We make observations and we use that data to say, do I have a good model, right? The idea of disproving a hypothesis is what lends its power to the scientific method. We should never accept or expect that our current understanding is correct. In fact, we have all the evidence to suggest that it's not, right? Because for the entirety of history, as we've been developing models of reality, scientific, physical, whatever it is, to date, if you look at every single past model, they've all been shown to be incorrect or incomplete in some way. That's 100% failure rate, right? And just statistically speaking, if we've got a past 100% failure rate, what are the odds that our current model is correct? Well, essentially zero, right? So we have every reason to do this. And which also leads to sort of a second psychological interesting sidebar. Why do we have trouble accepting that we might be wrong about something like this, right? Why is the ego of science so fragile? Why are we so fragile? Why are we so unprepared to accept the possibility that what we had believed before might be incorrect, right? Scientists, I think, tend to be a little bit, and I can beat up on them because I am one. I have my Ph.D. in physics, which gives me the license to sort of do a little bit of physicist bashing here. I think a lot of scientists don't understand necessarily what science is. They think about the idea and this goal of reducing the uncertainty in the world around them, of getting a complete understanding of everything that is, and not appreciating that what really is going on is we're simply continuing to explore on an ongoing basis using the scientific method, right, to help us hone in on the things that aren't, I should say hone in on that, hone out or trim out the things that aren't, this disproving of hypotheses in order to better be more effective at exploring the things that we don't know. Now, a lot of what happens in science runs into a bit of a challenge because we have a very specific focus in science, right? We look in at least mainstream science at the objective. And the reason for that really, I think, comes down to the desire for repeatability. We want to do this. And I was not there hundreds of years ago when this decision was made, but it makes sense when I think about what probably happened was, well, interesting things in the universe, they're objective things, they're subjective things. I can, I think, create reproducibility for objective reality. If I focus on those things, I can repeat my experiments over and over, and I can use that repeatability to understand the validity of what it is I'm doing. I can't do that with subjective concepts because there's no repeatability in the subjective, at least not in a reasonably finite time frame. I can't rerun an experiment that involves a person's thinking because that person now knows something different. They're not the same person as the first time the experiment was run. As such, I am unable to repeat that. And I can't find another person that is exactly like the person that I first did the experiment with, right? Everybody's got their own differences. And so it's fine. Okay, well, we'll focus on the objective. Unfortunately, what happened is that got something sort of perverted to concluding that the objective things in reality are the only real things in reality. That was just flat out a mistake, right? Fortunately for us today, science is kind of rediscovering that the importance of subjective experience, right? We're beginning to recognize the mistake that we can't just consider everything to be objective, that subjective things, and this is sort of woven through quantum mechanics, which is obviously very mainstream at this point, and a lot of other areas as well. So if we're going to come to grips with that we're not going to have the same approach to having repeatability in our experiments, right? We've just got to take other approaches for how do we study these things. We can do that. We've got lots of evidence that we can do that. In fact, living today are some 8+ billion pieces of evidence that we can do that. Human beings grow, they learn, they develop role models, all without relying on exact replicability, right? We always do these things. Children who pick up one item here and then they put it down, then they pick up a different item and then they do whatever. And they do this, but they don't have the exact repeatability. The thing about subjective science, and this is sort of an aside, but I think an important aside, is that if you are going to do that, it emphasizes the importance of the idea of know thyself, a phrase that surely I must have come up with, right? No, of course not, right? But if you think about the importance of understanding oneself, right? If you are going to study subjective things, what could possibly be more important than to understand what elements that you yourself as the subjective observer are putting in place in the system of observation, right? The better we know ourselves, the better we're able to understand what our own insertions are and assertions are. I think this is a key piece of the overall puzzle of turning this to subjective science. Another aspect of that is we really do have to recognize that the subjective is important, and we need to change our attitude towards the unexpected, right? Right now, I think people look at life, many people, not obviously all people, but many people look at life as an opportunity or a series of opportunities that you have a choice. In this opportunity, you failed or you were right, right? Those are your opportunities. Everything that comes up, I either got it right or I got it wrong. I think there's a different and a better way of looking at that. Rather than thinking about this in terms of right or wrong, seeing our lives as just a sequence of opportunities to grow and to learn, right? Changing that mental structure will put us in a far better stead to leverage the value that that anomalies are really offering. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think I see, at least at this point, anomalies. The real value of anomalies is that they are pointers to the weaknesses in our existing models. So let me give you a couple of examples what I think are weaknesses and consider the anomalies that point to them, right? We receive information, right? We perceive things in a fashion that does not conform to traditional five senses, as I mentioned before. right? Those things are considered an anomalous. Right? We receive information about events that are in the past or in the future, right? Past, we maybe an example of that is having recollections of past lives, or the future, the idea of premonitions, right? We have experiences in non-ordinary states of consciousness that are considered quite anomalous, near-death experiences, right? Cases where people, in fact, have a set of experiences and can't even put them into a time sequence until they've returned out of the non-ordinary state of reality. And when asked, well, how did that happen? They said, well, I couldn't put it in time sequence. They just happened. It wasn't one before the other, right? They didn't correspond to specific spatial locations in some cases. Right. And of course, the one that I mentioned before, that we can have an effect on these so-called objective systems with nothing more than our intentions, right? And if you think about, there are key assumptions in the mainstream scientific model that these stand in opposition to, right? The idea that we're physical beings, that we have our consciousness or our cognitive experiences are emergent from biological matter. Well, there's the brain, and then the question of the big or the hard question of consciousness. How does the brain generate consciousness? Oh, is that really a valid assumption to start from, that the brain generates conscious experience, right? But we have that assumption in many cases, right? We have the assumption that time and space are immutable properties of an objective universe. We think of ourselves as individual, isolated entities, right, in an objective universe without a level of interconnectedness. And I think probably if you're watching this, you probably believe that there is an interconnectedness, which is good, right? But if you think about all these different assumptions, there's a tremendous body of evidence that stands in opposition to them, right? We have experiences, as I mentioned, right? Awareness of things that happened while our brain was not functioning. Documented cases of that, right? Accessing information that goes beyond time and space. I read an article, a reference recently, that somebody talking about multiple personality case where the different personalities had different blood types. That's not supposed to be possible, right? Should we ignore a case like that? Or is that a motivation for us? That anomaly is a motivation for going back and questioning whether or not we really have it right. And of course, the idea that we are an atomic entity, right? I am Jeff, and that's all there is to it, right? But even if you think about that, that's sort of a crazy thought. I mean, just walk through the process of saying, well, there's say one bacteria, one bacterium, whatever the singular is, right? We have one bacterium that has that's a thing unto itself. It's got whatever it means to be a bacteria, whatever that is, it has its own awareness. Well, what about a colony of bacteria? Isn't that itself a thing made up of those individual cells of bacteria, right? And you could argue, like, isn't there different levels of consciousness? Isn't the consciousness of those individual bacteria in some way intertwined with each other? Right. And I use this as an example because we can sort of like put bacteria somewhere else and talk about it. But of course, where I'm going with this, right, is ourselves. I think the NIH studies say that for every one cell of our body that is sort of the traditional human cell, there's another 10 that are bacteria or fungi or anything else. The fact is, we're big biological collectives ourselves, right? We are a multitude of living things all working together as one symbiotic system, right? Is it so crazy to believe based on that we as individual humans are in fact just individual elements of a much greater organism, right? The Gaia effect that Jim started us off with. I think the implications of this, right, are strong. First of all, I think the idea that we don't recognize the value of anomalies does science a disservice. Right? The fact is that it is the unusual things that happen in science and engineering, by the way, right? And I think most people know the story of the post-it note adhesive, which was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to be that way, and yet it branched off into an entire very useful way of producing particular goods, right? Same kind of thing in science. It's the data that we didn't expect. It's the odd things that when we ignore them, we get ourselves into trouble. And when we explore them, we uncover all new phenomena, new understandings, right? So I think we should start looking at anomalies as signposts, right? To understand where is our understanding, if not mistaken, at least incomplete, right? And use that as a motivation for exploring them further. And the idea that we're of not discussing such experiences, right? We should be using these as opportunities to begin conversations instead of saying, I'm not sure I should tell people about this because this is just me. It's just weird. Surely no one else has had the experience of feeling like they've been connected to somebody from beyond the grave, or an entity that wasn't a person but it was a spirit, or I've had some experience with extraterrestrials, or whatever it is. The idea that we should stop looking at this as something that we need to be ashamed of or hesitant about sharing, but as opportunities to explore for other people, and to similarly use it as a motivation for us to become less judgmental, right? Open up the possibility that there may be things that we don't know as individuals that are out there in the world. Some of these anomalies can be incredibly informative, right? It's quite possible that they're telling us, and in fact, I do believe very specifically that they're telling us that this idea that we're physical beings that have minds is probably a misrepresentation. In fact, it's more likely that we are minds that have some physical manifestation associated with them, right? And similarly, just to sort of bring this back to the beginning and leave us a little bit of time to talk, right? I do want to just sort of re-emphasize the point about synchronicities, which is an anomaly that is a very exciting one when you have them. To understand, it often is the case that you only see them in sort of hindsight, but what I have been discovering and talking to a lot of people, including my own experiences, is that the more we focus on synchronicities, the more we recognize them, the more we begin to notice them and become attuned to the cases where they show up, right? And I think what I particularly like about that is that if you think about us as interconnected beings in a much larger system, those synchronicities, those interesting and meaningful touch points are telling us what are the things that are really proximate to us, with what things are we most tightly intertwined. If I have a synchronicity with somebody that is so bold and so recognizable, that probably tells me there's something really important. I have a certain level of proximity to this other person, this other thing, this other idea that is really meaningful for myself, right? In the syntropic way of looking at it, you could even say that these synchronicities provide us little breadcrumb hints as to what is the purpose that we're really aiming for. That again is a sort of a whole topic unto itself, so I'm not going to go in. But if I just sort of wrap this up to try to, if you again you're here, what's my main takeaway here? I think we should be looking at anomalies as gifts. I think they are ways of highlighting where we have opportunity to grow, where we fall short in terms of our understanding, and that if we can learn to cultivate a society that welcomes them, that recognizes their value, and uses them as the beginning points of conversations, we are going to grow not only faster, but I think in much healthier ways than sort of this blind, I'm just going to follow the consequences of mainstream science approach that often feels like the only option. So that is hopefully my takeaway. And Jim, I would love to engage in questions or dialogue following up on that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. You're always such a rich source of creativity and good ideas. So thank you for that. I wanted to just bring in something that Sharon Marvel was saying in the chat, that really the key is to get curiouser and curiouser about reality. If there's a virtue that the anomalous draws out of us, it's curiosity, right? To the
Indeed.
degree to which we think we have truth possessed, our curiosity goes away. But when we're in the spirit of truth pursued, curiosity, inquiry, questioning, uh, uh, seeking the anomalous becomes, an objective of our intellectual curiosity. So it's very interesting. So thank you, Sharon, for bringing that point in. Any comment you want to make on curiosity?
I can only say I think that it is maybe the most essential defining trait of humanity, right?
Yeah.
What is it that we could be if not curious, sensing creatures, right? That go into a lifetime for the purpose of wondering and exploring, right? The heart of curiosity. And similarly, also the most tragic that in many cases we hammer that curiosity out of our children,
Yeah.
is just heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
look at sort of the traditional school systems, the way that we tell kids, stop asking questions. Your questions are disruptive. What disruptive of what? What is more important
Right.
than those questions?
Yeah.
You know?
Eddie, why is there air? Yeah, all these big, huge questions that our kids ask. And that leads Jeff to a really interesting question from Brett Inzer about the nature of anomalies. And in your opinion, do anomalies come as a result of context or content? In other
That's a good
words, the
question.
subjective
Yeah.
paradigm relating to the objective data, going back to Thomas Kuhn, is that what is at fault? The context? Is that why anomalies emerge, or what else is going on? How would you place anomaly in that subject object continuum?
I think that, all right, well, let me back up one step out of that, and share something a little bit different. And I'm going to drive back to that point. Over the last roughly about a half a year, we've been having monthly conversations. There's a discussion series. We've got about a dozen people or so that every month we get together for 2 weeks and we talk about the nature of the quote unquote information field. And I put quotes around it because there isn't really a good definition of these sorts of things. But one of the points that has come out of this, a very profound point, is in looking at what is the nature of information, is that one cannot really separate this out, right? It's a complex idea, the idea of information that ties together symbols and meaning and all this. It's inherently a contextually driven idea. Our experiences of anything are driven, and our interpretations of them are driven by who we are and what we think, what we believe, the way that we interact with these. And so the asking if an anomaly is driven by sort of the person experiencing the anomaly versus the the thing that is anomalous that is outside of that. I think it's an interplay with both of them. Both have to be there. If you truly have no awareness of a thing, was it an anomaly? Well, if you have no awareness of it, it didn't really even happen for you. And so it wouldn't have been an anomaly in that sense. But I think it requires both components to work together to really have it. I don't know if that answered the question or if that um,
Yeah, but it's a very good question, Brett. Thank you, because the anomalous is both a data point unrecognized and a contextual point unrecognized. And that's what makes it anomalous. So it's worth further pondering, I think,
yeah.
about where it actually resides. But what was coming up into my
Well,
mind, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was going to say, and one thing to think about is if one has no expectations, there can be nothing anomalous, right? I mean, you have to have an expectation in order for something to defy it.
Good one. Good one. Good
Right?
one. Beginner's mind, right?
Yeah,
Beginner's mind. Without expectations, there's no anomalies. It just is what it
it
is.
is what it is. Exactly.
So that means it's context.
Yeah.
It's our perception of the objective world that is creating the expectation that what we're perceiving is normal and self-contained. Yeah. Good. Let's talk about black swan events. Because when Nassim Taleb came out with his book on black swans, it was really startling to the intellectual class anyway, that things like black swans, I'd like to really discuss for a moment the relationship between anomalies and black swan events, because black swan events can be perceived as anomalies. In fact, they are.
Mhm.
But when they're understood, you realize that they've been there all along. And it's your lack of appreciation of the possibility that created the anomaly, that creates the black swan event. And for everybody's edification, the black swan term came from the prevailing wisdom from Great Britain that there was no such thing as black swans, that all swans were white and they were all belonged to the queen. And then lo and behold, they found black swans in Australia. So that was the origin of the term of black swan. And Taleb talks about 9/11 as a black swan event. You can think of, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a black swan event. Events that happen, it appears, out of the blue. And yet, when you really understand the larger context, you realize that that event was inevitable and you just missed it because you weren't paying attention to the data. And to refer to your last comment, Jeff, is because you had certain expectations about reality. We saw that go on in the Middle East with the October 7th attack. The National Security Advisor to Joe Biden wrote in the October edition of Foreign Affairs, the most prestigious foreign policy journal in the world, that the Middle East was stable and they looked forward to an era of peace and stability. And then all of a sudden, Hamas attacked on October 7th, and we've seen what's happened. So October 7th was also a black swan event. And that leads to another dimension for many people. It was inevitable that that would happen because they were Palestinians. They had a different point of view than the US and Israel. So the black swan events are also a matter of perspective. What would be your comment?
Yeah, I think that last word is everything. It's a matter of perspective in a lot of this, right? We see these things happen in hindsight as we analyze and we say, aha, there were indicators here, there, and the other. And I think we are going to continue to see these for the rest of eternity. And the reason is because our approach to being creatures, to living, right, is to focus on a thing. And in doing so, or let me before I go into that, let me just sort of start at the most complete enlightened state, right? That transcendental, I am one with everything state that becomes indescribable. And then as you hone in, as you turn sort of more quote unquote human, right, into the day by day, and you have the experience of living, what you're doing is you're filtering out lots and lots of information to the point that you're now sort of living in sort of the normal life, if there's such a thing. And in doing so, you have focused your attention on a specific subset of the infinity that is out there, right? And by focusing, you inherently are not paying attention to these other things. If you were able to focus on all aspects of the world, right? Every day you woke up and you understood completely what was happening in religion and in finance and in technology and the list goes on, right? And you could keep all of those together and still be able to articulate it in sentences if such a thing was possible. Could you detect these? Well, perhaps. And a lot of maybe the things that happen where people precognitively say, wait, I think something really important is going to happen. Maybe what they're doing is they're reaching into a place where they're able to pull in more of that and see patterns in that. But in the day-to-day life, our goal is to focus on the things that are in front of us. I want to pay attention to my children. I want to see them growing up. I want to laugh with them. I want to do these things. And as such, right, we can't keep track of all the information that was necessary to understand the patterns that will eventually emerge. And so one day you see the huge wave that's coming out of the ocean and you go, well, I could have known that if I had looked 1,000 miles offshore and seen where, well, true, but there's an infinite number of those things that you would need to keep paying attention to. You don't know which one's coming next unless you pay attention to them all. So these black swan events, I think, are just a facet of the way that we exist and have a life to us, that we will always have things that surprise us, because we're living in an infinitely complex reality. Or maybe said differently, we have an infinitely complex way of understanding a fairly simple reality. Either way you look at it, amounts to the same.
Absolutely. My last question is around intuition and the phenomenon of the anomalous internal to ourselves. Because oftentimes we think of the anomalous as like we see a UFO and it's an unidentified anomalous phenomenon. But internally, we're also dealing with the anomalies of, for example, intuition. You're going down the street and all of a sudden you have this intuition that pops up into your awareness as a burst of either inspiration or a certainty about something that is generally contradicted by your rational mind.
Mm.
And then you go through a process. Do you honor this anomaly of intuition that just popped up, or do you repress it? Most of us repress it because we're taught to trust the rational and to mistrust the irrational. So I just wanted to have you comment also on the internal anomalies that we experience, the psychic realm, the consciousness realm, because these anomalies are omnipresent. They're external to us and they're deeply internal to us, and they're appearing all the time, challenging us in extraordinary ways.
It is, and the idea of intuition and this that we're getting some kind of information, some awareness that we're not supposed to, right? I think is tied into the fact that we have defined for ourselves how we're allowed to receive information. A person who is a practiced medium would find certain things far less anomalous than somebody who never encountered this idea. And intuition, I think, is another one of those. I think for when you sort of back up, and in fact, I mentioned earlier, right, the five senses. That, well, we've got these five senses. Those are the ways we get information. As I've thought about this, thought about what does a world look like, for example, that is independent of time, right? If time is a cognitive construct, what does a universe look like? What could we be doing? What does it mean to perceive independent of time? It has led me to the conclusion that we don't have five senses. We are simply sensory beings, and that we have language that allows us to describe things in five accepted categories, right? And this is the way we will talk about it. I get a sense, somebody's aura. Oh, how do I describe that to somebody? I see your aura. Was I seeing it the same way that I saw my cat? I don't know. It's not so clear. But seeing was the right way of mapping that description. It was at least closer to what I felt than hearing it or tasting it. Right. Okay, fine. So I'll say that I see it. But some people don't. And some people have the is it kinesthesiology where the senses are combining? I always forget that word for some reason. Right. But I think we have a tremendous amount of sensory things going on all the time. And the things that we consider anomalous are the senses that we're getting that we don't quite have the language internal to ourselves to describe. And we say, okay, well, that was anomalous. I had this sense, this intuition that this thing was happening, because that is a much more comfortable way of saying, I took a quick glance at the future and I realized that if I walk across the street now, that's not going to go well for me. Right. And so I'm not going to. And of course, it's a very complex thing. It's very difficult. How do you prove that? You only get to make one choice in a situation, right? Either I walk across the street or I didn't. So you never really know. And hence why people say, well, you should just go with what your rational expectations are. But you never know, right? You never know what it is that motivated you to go across that street. Oh, well, I'm worried that a car would come, so I'm not going to cross the street. And then I didn't cross the street and the car never came, but maybe you just added in that whole car thing because you know that cars travel on streets, but in fact, your motivation for not crossing or crossing the street had nothing to do with that. It was something else that was significant that was going to change in your life. I saw a thing that I would have seen a thing that I didn't see that maybe would have changed the way the rest of my day was going to go or the rest of my life was going to go. How do you know that? Well, you don't really get to, at least not while you're constrained in this sort of standard way of going through life. So I think that these anomalies, I think they're just aspects of ourselves that we don't really know how to talk about to ourselves.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
more practice we get with it, the more we develop that, the same way that we didn't know how to form language, full sentences when we were born, but we get there. We learn that, we evolve it, we absorb and eventually become fluent in it. And I think learning to accept the anomalous experience in our internal sense is just like that. The more we practice, the
Yeah.
better we get, the less anomalous it feels, the more we're able to distinguish what is a sense versus our fear of having the sense and all the rest of those and become more accurate in what we do.
It's interesting. Diana Windsor's making the point, cognition is mostly an adaptation to deal with sensory input.
Beautifully put.
Well done, Diana. That neatly summarized what Jeff just said. Well done. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. This has been very illuminating to me because I'm using anomalous in my vocabulary more now than I've ever used in my life.
Same.
As we get into these ET realms and remote viewing and all of that, there's more and more. Um, uh, I would almost say urgency for us to pay attention to the anomalous,
Yeah.
because I think the anomalous is what's up right now, because the old paradigm is in a crisis because it can't handle all the anomalies. And our task, that's what ICRL is doing. It's trying to create a whole new paradigm so that what was anomalous in the old paradigm becomes part of the normal science in the
Yeah.
new. Knowing that in time, our paradigm will be shattered too by increasing data. And that's the beauty and the joy and the exuberance of the universe in which we find ourselves, that it is infinite in every sense of the term. And we're finite, trying to figure it all out, as you say, because in order for us to survive, in order for us to cross the street, we've got to focus.
Yeah.
Jeff, thank you so much. Thank you so
Jim,
much.
it's such a pleasure as always. Thank you.
Yeah. I love the workings of your mind, my friend. Very, very good. So you can all
Likewise.
join Jeff in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. Stan has put it in. You also got it in your Zoom reminder for the session today. And then tomorrow, we're going to return to the issue of Gaza. And I'll be speaking from a Jungian point of view, which was my doctoral training, about the power of an archetype when it emerges into the collective psyche of a people and causes them to do what their rational minds would never do under normal circumstances. That's what we're seeing in Gaza, is an archetypal possession of Israel. And we need to understand that very, very deeply. So that'll be our subject for tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Jeff, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody in the after chat. Bye for now, everybody. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.